In this video, we are going to look at some of the applications associated with consumer theory. The first example that we are going to look at is the food stamps example, which is a very popular example among economists to demonstrate what you can do with consumer theory. Suppose that we have a consumer and the consumer has a budget constraint of 100. The price of non-food items is $1. The price of food items is $2, and the food stamps are worth $20. So note that those are all dollar amounts. If the consumer spends all the money on food, then the consumer can purchase $120 worth of food at the price of $2, and hence the consumer can purchase 60 units of food. Now note that if the consumer spends all the money on other goods, the consumer cannot purchase 120 units of other goods, but only 100 units, since food stamps can only be spent on food. Now, hence the demand function, the budget constraint is actually kinked like this, and the kink occurs at 10 units of food. Okay? Because if the consumer purchases 10 units of food, then the consumer spent the $20, and then we are facing a normal budget constraint. Now note that if this was a cash payment, so if the $20 would simply be a transfer to the consumer, then the consumer could indeed spend $120 on other items. So up here, we would have 120. Okay? Now, suppose that in a first situation or in a first case, and we are going to look at two cases, suppose that the consumer is consuming right here, and hence we do have a consumption of, say, QF prime, and we have a consumption of Q N prime. Okay? Now here, note that how this is drawn, the consumer is unaffected if you give the consumer the food stamps, or if you actually have a cash payment. Okay? Now, it will become clear of what exactly this means when we are looking at a second case. Suppose that we now have the same situation where we have the consumer having a budget constraint that allows them to purchase 100 units of other goods. We have the budget, if only food is purchased, then 60 units of food are purchased. And we have the kink of the budget constraint at 10. Now, suppose that this consumer does not purchase a lot of food. And suppose that the consumer, the indifference curve with the initial consumption is going right through this point here, where we have the kink. Now, the question is, can the consumer be made better off? Now, suppose that in this case, we are changing the policy that the consumer does not receive the $20 in food stamps, but receives the $20 in cash. And hence, the budget constraint is going to extend like this. Okay? Going here up to 120. Now note what happens. In this case, if with the food stamps, the consumer consumes here. But if we have a cash payment instead, then the consumer would actually not consume here anymore, but would be able to consume at this point here. Now, how is this point different from the original consumption bundle with the food stamps? First of all, we can see that the consumer is going to purchase less food. The consumer is going to purchase more of the other food items, more of the non-food items. But we can also see that the consumer is achieving an indifference curve associated with a higher level of utility. Okay? And hence that the switching the food stamps from the food stamps to a cash payment would make the food stamp recipient here, in this case, better off. Okay? Now note that you can look at this example also from a slightly different perspective. Here, in this first case that we considered, or in this case that we considered, we said, well, the food stamps are inefficient because for the same amount, for $20, but $20 in cash instead of $20 in food stamp, we can make the consumer better off. Now, we can also look at this from a different perspective. You can think of, well, if we change to a cash payment instead of food stamps, and suppose we simply want to keep the happiness or the utility of the food stamp recipient at the same level, we can also achieve this by reducing the payment to the food stamp recipient or to the consumer. In this case, that instead of giving $20 in food stamps, we could give the consumer a slightly lower amount, but in cash, such that the consumer is as happy as with the food stamps, but the program would actually be cheaper. Now, of course, I am aware that there are many aspects related to food stamps, but this is one example on how to use consumer theory to analyze a problem related to policy. The second example is regarding food delivery service. Suppose that we are currently using a food delivery service that ships us a box of ingredients, and we simply have to cook the ingredients to have a delicious meal. We have a budget of $1,000 per month, and this meal kit costs $20 per meal. We also spend money on other goods, and the price of other goods is $10. I have illustrated this budget constraint, which is consistent with those prices and income, in the sense that if we were to spend all the money on those food kits or those ingredient kits, we could purchase 50 meals. And if we were to spend all the money on other goods, we could purchase 100 items of other goods. But our preferences are such that we are currently consuming 20 meals and 60 units of other goods. We know that because we assume that we have a preference, an indifference curve, which is tangent right at the budget constraint, okay? Where the points are 20 meals and 60 units of other goods. Now, suppose that there's a new service, a new food delivery service that works slightly differently. You don't pay by the meal. Well, you do, but to a slightly different degree, because you have a $200 flat fee, and then every meal costs $10. Okay? Now the question is, would you remain with the old food service, or would you switch to the new food service delivery? Now let me just illustrate the new budget constraint, which is consistent with this scheme here. Note that, and here it's at this point, at the initial point, the intercept, it's slightly incorrect here a bit, but we have a $200 flat fee, which means that we have only $800 left for other goods. Okay, so theoretically we could spend the $200 and then still consume 80 units of other goods and 0 units on the meals. But then we have a budget constraint that is looking like this. Okay, so here we have 80 units. Okay, and if we are spending all the food, all our income on meals, then we could purchase 80 units of meals, right? $1,000 minus 200, the flat fee. We have $800 remaining, and then the per meal cost is $10. 800 divided by 10 would give us 80 meals. Okay. Now the question is, would we switch the food service? Now compare the old budget constraint and the indifference curve, which is tangent at that old budget constraint right at this point here. Note that at this point, we are spending with the old budget constraint, we are spending 20 times $20 in meals. So at point A, our expenditure on meals is $400. Okay. Now note that since the flat fee is $200, the cost per meal is $10, that the budget constraint, if you're constructing the new budget constraint, is such that this old bundle exactly costs $200, exactly costs $400 under the new budget constraint. Okay, so if we wanted to consume here, we currently do, and we spend $400, we could also consume with the new service at this point, and we would be spending $400 on food, in the sense that we would be spending $200 in the flat fee, and then we would purchase 20 meals at $10 each. So we would be spending $400. So this original point is also affordable with the new food service. However, as you can see, that we now have this part here, okay, where if we rearranged our consumption, in the sense that if we were to purchase more food with the new service, we could achieve a higher level of utility. Okay, so with the new service, we would be increasing our food consumption, we would be decreasing our consumption of other goods, okay, and we could achieve a higher level of utility, which means is, yes, we would switch to the new food service, okay? Because this point here was not affordable under the old budget constraint, the blue line here, but it is now affordable under the new budget constraint, where we have the $200 flat fee and the $10 per meal. Okay, so this is a second application of consumer theory. The last example is slightly more evolved. Here we are going to consider the difference of a per unit tax versus a lump sum tax. A per unit tax is a tax that is levied on each unit a consumer purchases of a particular good. Okay? Versus a lump sum tax, think about a lump sum tax like an income tax, where a fixed amount is taken from the budget, but there is no tax on individual units. If we do not have a tax at all, then our budget constraint is the regular budget constraint, where we have Px times Qx plus Py times Qy equals our budget. Now, in the case of a per unit tax, and here we are only taxing one item, or one good, and that is going to be good X. If we have a per unit tax, then the price of X is actually increased in the amount of the tax. Suppose that we have a $1 per unit tax on good X. What this means is that for each good you are purchasing, or for each unit you are purchasing, you are paying $1 in tax. So hence the price of X is now Px plus the per unit amount, that's little t here, times Qx plus Py times Qy. We do not have a per unit tax on good Y, equals the budget. Okay. Now note that here, what we are going to do for the lump sum tax, we are going to take the per unit tax, and the amount of the lump sum tax is going to be equal to T times Qx. Okay? So what this means is that our tax revenue is going to be exactly the same amount than the per unit tax revenue. And we set this to capital T. So hence the budget constraint for the lump sum tax is going to be Px times Qx plus Py times Qy equals the budget we had initially minus T. Okay? Where T is the same amount as the per unit tax revenue. Okay? So now when we represent this graphically, then we have the following. Okay? So note that we are going to have the good, which is taxed on the horizontal axis, and the untaxed good on the vertical axis. So if we have the situation without any tax, then we have a budget constraint that looks like this, and assume that both goods are consumed, and hence we have some indifference curve which is tangent to the budget constraint. And let's assume that this is the consumption. Let's call this Q1, and actually let's call it Q prime, and Q prime X and Q prime Y. So this is the amount consumed of both goods without any tax. Okay, so let's call this point A. Okay, and this corresponds to the no tax situation. Let's put this one here. This is no tax. Now, if we have a per unit tax, then the budget constraint is going to be rotating inwards, okay? Because we now have a per unit tax, which increases the price, okay, for X, and hence that is equivalent of inward rotation. So here we have our new budget constraint, okay? So the green one, and we are going to call this soon point B, is going to be the per unit tax. Okay. And of course, since point A is not affordable anymore, the consumer has to rearrange or rearrange the goods consumed. And suppose that the consumer is now consuming at the point here. And let's call this point point B, okay, which is this point here. Okay, so clearly it is obvious that with the per unit tax, as opposed to the no tax scenario, the consumer is not as well off. Now note that the difference between the per unit tax and the lump sum tax is that the per unit tax is rotating the budget constraint. It's changing the slope of the budget constraint. Whereas now the lump sum tax, okay, is going to be considered or equivalent to a change in income. And if you remember, a change in income results in a parallel shift of the budget constraint. Okay? But since we have set the lump sum tax in the same amount of as the per unit tax, the budget constraint associated with the lump sum tax goes through this point here, but is parallel to the original budget constraint. So we have something like this, okay, where it's not very well drawn, but the red line and the blue line are identical in slope, okay, or in the sense that they are parallel. Now, you can see now that the consumer can actually increase their utility or has a higher utility with the lump sum tax than with the per unit tax. Okay, so here the consumer is at point C, which is the lump sum tax. And hence the consumer is better off with the lump sum tax as opposed to the per unit tax.